If you don't know this about me yet, you should know I'm kind of an intense person. I'm sure most of you know. But I think this intensity helps me to see this story. So I'm going to share a story of my own moment of intensity, and then hopefully that will enlighten our imagining of this story. So in 2019, I went before the Board of Ordained Ministry to seek commissioning. This is a major step in the process towards ordination. I was in my final semester of seminary, so I was almost done with my education. I had been approved by 2 other committees in the years prior to this one to get to this place. I'd written so many pages about my understanding of God, the church, and my own sense of call. In fact, when I heard the call, when I became sure of the path that God had set me on, when I consented to walk down this road, I was a freshman in college, and I had started plotting out the road ahead. To this day, there still lives a document in my Google Drive entitled Timeline for Ordination. Once I had agreed to walk down this path with God, I became single-minded. I researched seminaries. I studied, shaping my undergraduate education to prepare me for parish ministry. I advocated for myself and my process to move at the pace I needed it to move. I sought internships and scholarships. It was a bit intense. So when I found myself at Dumas Bay Retreat Center in Federal Way, where our interviews take place, preparing for my 4th interview in 2 days, I found myself having that same intensity as that college freshman had typing up a timeline for ordination. At the start of my interviews at Dumas Bay that year, the first of 4, I started getting back pain. I must have slept wrong or sat wrong on the airplane from Chicago, stressed myself into a strained muscle. Or I might have just been holding my body quite intensely, mirroring this intensity that was coursing through me. So for interviews 2 and 3, which were group interviews, I stood behind my chair to stay present to the questions, to respond with diligence and accuracy and poignancy without pain. But the 4th interview is solo. It's no longer group interviews. In the 4th interview, you're alone. There are no longer other people's answers to play off of. There's no other people to take up time. It's just you and a panel of like 10 clergy. My interview was after lunch, maybe like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, so I had time to waste. There were several hours I had to fill up before I went into what felt like my gauntlet. The intensity was just coursing through my body. It was intense because the stakes were high. For one, I had to prove to my parents that I would be a self-sustaining adult, and that the career path that I had chosen with 2 of the lowest paying salaries in our economy, that the majors I chose were a good investment. The stakes were high because I was clear that this was and is God's call on my life. The experience and the outcome would have something to say about my identity and my purpose in life. And I wasn't sure that I could handle a barrier in my purpose and identity, a challenge to my identity and purpose. So with pain in my back and intensity coursing through my flesh and blood and bones, I decided to go for a walk. I put my headphones in, and I decided I'd walk laps around the path that's there at the retreat center. The path is sort of in a figure 8 shape, which strangely is basically the path we walked today during the Palm Sunday processional. It was a figure 8 shape and maybe like 1/8 of a mile per lap. It's very small. But for me on that day, it became sort of a labyrinth. I didn't have to think about navigating where I was going. I could just walk. So tennis shoes on, headphones in, body move fast. I needed to move in a way that matched the intensity that I was feeling in my body. My brain was moving fast, my heart was pounding fast, the adrenaline was pumping. I knew I was absolutely exhausted at some level, but my eyes, they were wide open, and everything in me was preparing for the test of my life. The most visceral memory of this moment for me was not the path or the walking or how many steps I took, but it was the song that was playing on repeat in my headphones. If you're familiar with it, it's Shake It Out by Florence and the Machine, played on shuffle. It played on shuffle, but after one time through, I put it on repeat. It played over and over and over again. The song matched my intensity in its dynamics and its pace, but it also named in its lyrics a spiritual battle, a proclamation of victory and perseverance. Florence sings, "Every demon wants his pound of flesh, but I like to keep some things to myself." And later she says, "It's hard to dance with the devil on your back, so shake him off." Now, I didn't really think that my back pain was the devil on my back, but naming all that was standing in between me and the call God had placed on my life as a wicked spiritual force beyond myself that I had the power to fight was actually really empowering. I don't name the board of ordained ministry as this wicked spiritual force, by the way. It was just all of my self-doubt and my fear and all of the ways that I compared myself to my colleagues, all of the ways that I could sabotage myself in this interview. That's what was standing between me and this call. So my walk, my song, my prayer armored me for the true, deep, challenging, rigorous work that was ahead of me. It is hard to dance with the devil on your back, so shake him off. It is much easier to dance, to battle everything that would hide and obscure your beloved, dignified, talented, flourishing self when we wear the full armor of God. When we wear the belt of truth, the breastplate of justice, the shoes of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. I didn't know it, but my walk in figure eights was my way of putting on my armor. Not to obscure myself, not to put on a facade or to be self-protecting or defensive, but in a way that feels a little bit like magic. Putting on the full armor of God both makes you more vulnerable, meaning more honest and forthcoming, more yourself, as well as grounded in reality, in the here and now, which includes knowing what is actually at stake. Putting on the full armor of God does not make you some kind of soldier, but it invites you to be fully human, to accept the full range of your own power, to exercise muscles that will absolutely contribute to the forward movement of this world toward the one that is to come, the world as God dreams it to be. On that walk, I had to come to terms with the fact, I discerned in that moment, I want to be commissioned. I don't want some facade of myself to be commissioned. I want to be commissioned. I want to be ordained. I want them to ordain me. Not some image of myself I project, but me, which required putting on the armor of God, putting on first the belt of truth. What we see of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is a night of intense prayer. To be clear, I make no claims that my commissioning and Jesus preparing for crucifixion are the same, but both required practices of intense prayer. Jesus knew what was ahead fully: an arrest, a trial, humiliation, crucifixion, slow, public, embarrassing death. Jesus was preparing for the gauntlet, for the test of his life. Could he make it through without retaliating, without sinking to their level? Could he continue to hold his head high when they spat on him or placed a crown of thorns on his head? Could he trust that God was with him? With this kind of intensity, with the stakes, the risks being so tremendously high, I I think our natural human response is to pray with that same physical intensity as what it feels like spiritually. I couldn't imagine in my moment of intensity to quietly kneel at the bedside and pray in my mind in a nicely worded prayer with my hands folded. I needed a prayer that embodied what was going on in my soul. And I see this in Jesus too. The gospel writers tell us that he is lying flat on his face here in the dark garden next to olive trees, right, that bear fruit that will be plucked, pressed, poured out into olive oil, right? Plucked, pressed, poured out, just like him. He needs to embody the helplessness he feels, the desperation he feels, the lowliness he is experiencing. So he lays with his face to the ground, crying out to God, asking for a way out, if possible, praying himself into accepting what was to come. And when he invites the disciples into the same prayer practice, to lay with their faces flat to the ground too, they don't sweat blood alongside him. They fall asleep because their inner lives, their souls, were not bothered. Their souls were not disturbed. Their souls are not experiencing this same intensity and risk and fear that Jesus is. Even if they could have wrapped their minds, like cognitively, around what was about to happen, the horror of it, at the end of the day, it wasn't happening to them. What was at stake for Jesus and what's at stake for the disciples were at two wildly different levels. And the disciples, they weren't ready, to be honest. They had not prepared well enough to be tested. Jesus had prepared. In the 40 days before Jesus began public ministry, he went out to the desert to fast and pray, where he was tempted by the devil at least 3 times. He was taken to the highest point of the temple and promised all the powers and riches of the world if only he would bow down to Satan. He resisted. He was tempted to use the powers of God to make bread out of stones, to use God's power for a quick fix, and to break the promise Jesus had made to fast those 40 days. And he was tempted to jump off of a high pinnacle and trust that the angels would catch his fall, putting God to the test and risking his own life unnecessarily. He resisted. The disciples, however, in the coming days would betray and deny Jesus for much less temptation. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, failing his parallel threefold temptation by Satan. Peter commits blasphemy. Judas will betray Jesus in moments after this prayer in the garden, selling Jesus for a pittance. Most of the other disciples would scatter. Only Mary, the mother of Jesus, John, and the women would remain at the cross to see his death through. It is clear by the end of this story who has prepared to walk through the gauntlet with Jesus and who has not. Friends, I think we all walk through a gauntlet at some point in our lives. We will all have our dignity, our call, our personhood, our story, our identity, our relationships, our lives, and our livelihoods tested and tried. And it's not that I think spiritual fitness, that practice and exercise and intensity of prayer will ensure our success or good outcomes. But spiritual fitness, practice and exercise in intensity of prayer and practice will help us to endure the temptations to sell ourselves and one another out when the time comes. It will guard us against losing our soul. It will guard against our scattering at the foot of the cross when we are faced with the absolute wretchedness of this world. It will empower us to enter into those periods of intensity for one another so that we can stay awake with each other through the night. Even when the stakes aren't high for us personally, we will be able to go there to pray with Jesus in the garden, staying awake to his fear and desperation. It is our call and our duty to prepare for temptations and trials of many kinds, that we might, as Ephesians says, make a stand against the tricks of the devil. We aren't fighting against human enemies, but against rulers, authorities, forces of cosmic darkness, and spiritual powers of evil in the heavens. Therefore, pick up the full armor of God, so that you can stand your ground on the evil day, and after you have done everything possible, to still stand. So stand with the belt of truth around your waist, justice as your breastplate, and put shoes on your feet so that you are ready to spread the good news of peace. Above all, carry the shield of faith so that you can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is God's word. Friends, may it be so. Amen.